Hello, everyone. This is Larry. I'm the Chief Intelligence Officer for the Collapse Survivor app.
And I'm Dr. Drew Miller. I'm CEO of Fortitude Ranch and a survival expert consultant for this Collapse Survivor app.
So, in this scenario that we're going to talk about, it was a limited nuclear war between Pakistan and India. So, what we're going to do is we're going to cover what happened in this simulation and how a limited battlefield nuclear war, which, by the way, has not occurred before, could be fought. Now, the big potential threat for someone, especially those not on the battlefield, is going to be a nuclear winter. And that is going to create an enormous survival challenge for those people that have to face that. And so there will be some discussion through this podcast about that survival challenge and how to meet those tasks. So, little background for you here. Pakistan and India, they've been fighting each other basically since the two countries were created in 1947 when the British Commonwealth gave up India. During that time of these minor skirmishes and major wars between the two countries, uh, India developed an arsenal in 1964 with nuclear weapons involved. Pakistan itself added nuclear weapons into their arsenal in 1998. So while India has basically evolved into a fairly well developed country with a thriving democracy and economy, Pakistan, on the other side of that coin, has not. It's in pretty bad shape. A long list of bad things: a bad economy, bad water shortages, a bad unemployment numbers. Uh, on top of that, a government that's pretty much monetarily very poor and very unpopular. And so that's the basis for this war that takes place in this scenario. The Pakistan government sees no way out of the current situation that they're in and concludes that a limited but surprise nuclear attack on India with a rapid occupation of Indian territory with limited objectives of seizing key water sources, the area of Kashmir, and some great farmland from India. For them, that's their best chance of solving some of their most critical problems that Pakistan is currently facing. And on top of that, it would save the reputation and probably gain some popular support for that now, that weak and unpopular struggling government that we see today. Now, Pakistan's also got an ace card up its sleeve, and that's support from China. The United States, we're allied with India today. China backs Pakistan. So in this scenario, China secretly gives Pakistan a lot of military aid prior to the attack, including some training on how to fight a tactical nuclear war. More important, they make it very well known in their threat to invade India if by any chance India launches a nuclear attack against Pakistan or generates any fallout that would fall on Chinese soil.
Before we get going in this high-level overview of a strategic versus tactical nuclear weapons, I need to kind of highlight my qualifications. I was an intelligence officer both at Strategic Air Command Headquarters and later U.S. Strategic Command. And my PhD dissertation at Harvard University was on underground nuclear defense shelters and field fortifications for NATO troops. This message traffic item here you saw in the scenario showing a shallow buried tactical nuclear shelter is actually from my PhD dissertation. The US has a doctrine of mutually assured destruction, and we basically say only strategic nuclear weapons matter. We actually US gave up battlefield tactical nuclear weapons, completely gone from the Army arsenal, and just a very few numbers that aren't very responsive left in the US Air Force. And as a result of that, and this was driven by political correctness reasons, not by good military reasons, U.S. nuclear doctrine says any use of nuclear weapons will escalate to strategic nuclear weapons and mutually assured destruction. A lot of people, including myself and probably Russia and China, believe that that's nonsense. There's no way a U.S. president is going to start using nuclear weapons to defend Taiwan. We had that in an earlier scenario where the U.S. backed down when the China used nuclear weapons to force the U.S. to back down. And in this case, Pakistan attacks India with the same kind of threat. They do basically, as we'll see, just battlefield nuclear weapons use, tactical use, and they avoid attacking Indian cities and threaten that if India attacks Pakistani cities, then they will, nuke the HE out of Chinese cities. So that's a basic scenario that plays out in this scenario here. So limited nuclear war, although U.S. doctrine says, oh, you can never talk about limited use of nuclear weapons, that sounds like you like nuclear weapons. So it's politically incorrect in the U.S. But militarily, it's quite possible, and that's exactly what played out in this scenario. So Pakistan invades India, not the whole country, just in the Northwest Territory in Kashmir and the northwest part of Punjab. And they attack with just 20 small, low-yield nuclear weapons, airbursts to limit fallout, and they went after Indian Army units and some air bases in that region. And then they quickly rushed Pakistani troops in across the border into India. So if India was going to now attack India or Pakistani troops in India, they'd be basically, dropping nuclear weapons on their own soil. And at the same time, they made the threat to India, we've not attacked your big cities, but if you attack us, our big cities we'll retaliate against yours. And they're also, as you'll see later, backed up by China in doing this. So India eventually does respond with nuclear attacks against Pakistan, but they're also limited battlefield nuclear strikes. Neither side will benefit by dropping nuclear weapons on the enemy, leading to retaliation that leads to their cities being attacked. That's the basic common sense of limited nuclear war. That's the intelligent way to think about it. It is not U.S. nuclear doctrine whatsoever. But that's what plays out in this scenario. And the other thing I mentioned is that, China is there also in this scenario, also telling India, if you do major attacks on India, if you do ground bursts that generate fallout that strike our soil, we will invade you, not just Pakistan. The other thing is that both sides keep big nuclear weapons in reserve. They refrain from attacks on cities. And Pakistan, they get the advantage of a surprise attack. Plus, they immediately disperse their nuclear weapons, so it's hard for India to get them. India has ballistic missile submarines, so they've got plenty of nuclear weapons they can use against Pakistan. But Pakistan also has, they both have roughly 200 nuclear weapons at the start. There's concern, it's not clear in this scenario, that actually China may have given Pakistan some additional nuclear weapons. We don't really know. That's not really covered clearly in the simulation. Again, there's fog of war in scenarios, and we try to duplicate that in here. But basically, neither Pakistan nor India engage in major strategic nuclear attacks on the other side cities because they don't want to face that kind of retaliation. So neither side does what's called counter value attacks on big cities. They stay limited to nuclear or to battlefield targets. And as a result of that, while millions of people are dying from both the conventional combat and the battlefield nuclear strikes, the difference would be 100 million or more people dying. Again, there's like 1 billion people in India. It's a very populous country. Same thing with Pakistan, very densely, highly populated country. Neither side wants that, and so they do end up fighting a limited nuclear war, which again is completely contrary to U.S. doctrine for nuclear warfare, which is we are not even allowed to talk about. And when I say we're not even allowed to talk about, I can give you a personal example. As an Air Force officer, I had a paper on limited nuclear warfare accepted for publication by the Army's major journal, Military Review, and it didn't get published. It was censored by the Office of Public Affairs because limited nuclear war for decades has been an absolutely taboo topic in the United States. And when we gave up our battlefield nuclear weapons, do you think either Russia or China followed? That's a question for you, Larry. Do you think they gave up battlefield nuclear weapons because we had?
Oh, that's a really tough one. Yeah, no, they did not.
No, they did not. Not only did they not give them up, they've continued to modernize and expand them. And more importantly, they train with them. So you've heard Putin recently doing exercises with battlefield nuclear weapons over in Ukraine. Well, not in Ukraine, but next to Ukraine, in Belarus and in Russia, and threatening very openly that he's going to use nuclear weapons in that war there. So this scenario was Pakistan-India nuclear war. This very well could be a similar thing going on in Ukraine or elsewhere. So our doctrine again says limited nuclear warfare is impossible. Common sense in this scenario tells you no, it's quite feasible actually. So for survival now, we're going to kind of transition more now to general survival issues. The big threat in the nuclear exchange of any type is EMP, electromagnetic pulse, because you only need one or a couple nuclear weapons to go off in the atmosphere, and you can destroy electric grids, computer systems, chips, all kinds of electronic systems. Pakistan did do a small EMP attack, but again, they're doing a limited war. They're not trying to take out all or capture all of India. They were limited just to northwest India. And the other problem they've got or constraint they had is they don't want to hurt China. You know, people think of Kashmir just as Pakistan and India. Kashmir is also partially controlled by China. They are there. So Pakistan did a small, they detonated up in the atmosphere, but not way up in the atmosphere, and had some EMP impact on the Indian Army and their civilian infrastructure, but not a big one. But for the U.S., that is our big Achilles heel. Not just our electric system, but why do we have such a great military? Well, it's training and good equipment, but it's technology. We have very advanced technical weapons. That means electronics. Our strategic nuclear systems are fairly well hardened against EMP, not so much with the tactical systems. So if the U.S. is involved in a nuclear war, battlefield nuclear war, we don't have the weapons for it now. They're just F-16 tactical low yield weapons, but they're not responsive. It's not like an artillery shell like we used to have. Then the Army had battlefield nuclear weapons. And we still have this great vulnerability that we really, really do need computers and chips and advanced systems. Russia and China and many other militaries, they fight with numbers. And so they're not as vulnerable to that. Larry, did you have some more comments on this slide, or did I cover most of the issues there?
No, you basically covered it, especially the piece where today uh, the Russians, the Chinese, they are very actively training that real world scenario in case of a tactical nuclear war. They are definitely working on making sure they understand how to move those pieces around on the map
Yeah.
when that happens. So that yeah, you nailed that one. So basically, in this simulation, the Pakistani troops they exploit the initial surprise nuclear attacks. And as mentioned just briefly, just a second ago by Drew, some of these follow-on attacks they made some modest penetrations into India. Now, this was not a campaign to destroy India, as mentioned by Drew, but it was to seize territory quickly that they wanted to keep to help them with some of their problems, water, and the agricultural needs of Pakistan. So while China pressured India to agree to a ceasefire and give up some of that territory or risk both a much worse nuclear war and a Chinese invasion of India, India basically had to give up on Kashmir and that northwest corner of Punjab. A relative, when you look at it, it's a relatively small portion of territory, less than 5% of its entire country, but there was just total humiliation in that significant loss. Pakistan, on the other hand, not only gained valuable water resources and agricultural resources, but they pushed the border with India back from Islamabad, which is the capital, the Pakistani capital, from 50 miles to 200 miles. That was a big deal. Now, India under threats from Pakistan and China, and on top of that, a lot of pressure from the United States, United Kingdom, France, with Russia backing China, basically the five biggest nuclear powers on the planet, they had to back down, which was blatantly wrong. This was an evil attack by Pakistan against India. For the Pakistani government, this was a huge success. They attained water and agricultural land from their quick thrust into that area. Their big enemy, India, was humiliated on the global scene, and there was a huge life saving credibility boost for the Pakistani government. This was a bad thing for the world in politics when you think about it. And even worse, it was horrible for India. And unfortunately, this is a very feasible scenario that could take place. So we asked a poll question in this simulation as to whether or not this scenario seemed to be a credible one or not. So let's think about this. As the question noted, World War One began from a chain of events after the assassination of a very minor political figure, the Archduke, with all kinds of bad government and political decisions that followed that assassination, which led to a horrible, costly global world war that made no sense, tremendously destructive to all countries involved.
Again, the popular view in the US is that a limited nuclear war is impossible. We don't really regard a major nuclear war between two countries to be possible. But if you look at the lessons of history, and Larry outlined one of them, but there's a lot more. Irrational things happen all the time in history, and wars happen all the time. For example, the war in Ukraine today, it seems very irrational. It's certainly very costly. But for a failing government like Pakistan, the loss of millions of its citizens in a nuclear war is a small price to pay for improving their hold on power and their reputation. And that's a lot of the concern people have with the situation with Russia and Ukraine today. Yes, it's very bad for Russia, but for Putin, it may be worth doing. Same thing with the Chinese invasion of Taiwan. So I do think this is a very realistic simulation and scenario, and a war like this could happen at any time. And again, nuclear weapons use in Ukraine. Russia's been telling people openly for years they're willing to use nuclear weapons, and they've been threatening recently to not just use them in Ukraine, but to use them against the UK and France and countries that are giving long-range conventional munitions to Ukraine that are being fired deep into Russian territory, and they're blatantly saying that they're willing to retaliate with nuclear weapons against that, and that could happen at any time. So a major nuclear war, especially with lots of ground bursts detonating detonating not in the air, but on the ground or where the fireball can reach the earth, generates a lot of radioactive fallout. In this case, that didn't happen. Both sides tried to avoid that. Pakistan, because they didn't want to, push India too far. And India certainly didn't want ground bursts and fallout because with the prevailing winds, even if they dropped them on Pakistani territory, a lot of the fallout would end up in India. If either side had detonated high yield nuclear weapons in ground burst attacks on enemy large cities, there would have been massive radioactive fallout and a lot of dust and debris reaching up into the stratosphere where it can block sunlight. That is where this term nuclear winter comes from. It can lead to cooling, massive crop failures, not just locally, but worldwide, or at least in the northern hemisphere, and it's something like this. And this is why India was under such pressure not to retaliate from all sides, not just China, but from the US and others, because no one around the world wanted to have a major nuclear war with big fallout and potentially nuclear winter. And China in particular was telling India, you better not cause anything that leads to radioactive fallout on our territory. But they had other countries saying that as well. So the big survival question is if a nuclear winter had occurred, and it could occur in a situation like, Russia using nuclear weapons in Ukraine and that expanding into Europe. If that happens and there's major crop failures, how do you survive? And the basic answer to that question is, well, it's basically the same thing you do to survive almost any collapse. There's 11 basic requirements to survive any kind of a big disaster. They're listed here on this slide. If you really want to understand them, we recommend you go to the Collapse Survivor website. There's the preparedness knowledge base there, and it's got a section on survival requirements where it has a short little briefing on how these 11 requirements, how they came up with them. Now, in a nuclear winter, you could have a situation where there's worse food production and more starvation. And the other problem you would have that might be a little bit more special in nuclear winter is harder gardening. I mean, at Fortitude Ranch, yes, we stockpile food and we've got ranch animals, but really the key to long-term survival is gardening, high-calorie crops. And I'll talk about one here in a minute here. So if there's a nuclear winter going on, your garden yields are going to be lower. They're probably not going to be wiped out completely. That's unlikely unless, really, really big nuclear exchanges. But something like this within India, Pakistan, if they'd had a lot of strategic counter city attacks going on, you could expect a lot less yield from your gardens, and that could be a significant survival issue to deal with.
So let's take a look now at some general survival lessons. As a result of the fears of nuclear winter and big drops in food production, likely starvation to follow with that, looting broke out in several other countries, including the United States, Canada, and some European countries. So, as we pointed out in other scenarios, more and more people are trained or preconditioned to anticipate that when there is a collapse, starvation is definitely coming and you're going to need to steal food so you do not starve to death. So gangs, criminals, bad people, all those folks with ill intent, they're going to be looking for an excuse to start looting. And in this slide, you take a look at it, the United States raises its DEFCON status, its defense condition. That is indeed a credible warning of a potential war coming. So the United States reached its highest DEFCON level ever, DEFCON 2, during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Now, the Collapse Survivor app would very likely issue a threat warning of its own uh, when when the United States would raise its DEFCON level, and would also issue some guidance as to whether or not you take shelter immediately, or you just stay closer to home, or actually get ready to go to or actually go to your bug out location that might be better prepared.
So in this exercise message that came up in this scenario, they talked about Jerusalem artichoke, and we really want to foot stomp on this. If you've got even a few square feet of land that you own and control that you can plant, we highly recommend you plant Jerusalem artichoke. I believe it's the number one best survival plant you can have. Yes, corn and potatoes are a lot more tasty, and they may even have a little bit more calories per acre, but they're harder to grow and they require more care and better soil. But most important, Jerusalem artichoke is a perennial. It keeps coming up year after year and it spreads. If you don't harvest it in the fall, that's okay. Odds are those roots, the tubers, which is what you eat, are going to be okay as surviving in the winter underground. So in the spring, you can dig them up and you've got a survival food. It is unfortunately regarded by a weed as a weed, and many people don't want it for that reason, which I think is kind of silly. The biggest problem is it's just very in the United States at least it's very hard to get Jerusalem artichoke. You can't find nurseries with it, but we're hoping the demand for that will increase. But it's not a prickly or bad or ugly plant. It looks like a sunflower. It actually looks fairly nice. We've got it planted at Fortitude Ranch location, and we strongly recommend that you plant Jerusalem artichoke. There's some survival product decisions you had to make in this simulation and scenario, and we want to focus here for a minute on just this one here. These are pretty cool, really neat foldable survival rifles. Most prepper bug out bags probably just have a pistol in them, and I highly recommend that you do have a pistol in your bug out bag, a 9mm or a larger caliber pistol for self defense. But if you want to shoot some game, shoot some rabbits while you're out there until you get to your bug out location, or even if you're trying to survive on your own, you really need a rifle. And now a 22 rifle is not going to be very good at killing a marauder, but if you want to shoot at a marauder at long distance to wound them and scare them off, a rifle will work. A pistol is just not very effective at long range. So this is a Henry foiling rifle, and they have more calibers than just 22 rifle. There's some bigger ones, but since they are bigger and heavier for a bug out bag, for a lot of people, this 22 long rifle might be something you want to look at.
So we normally try and conclude with prepper jokes, but we're running along on this podcast, so we're going to kind of pass on that. But if you do have some good prepper humor, we'd love to see it. So just send us or send it to us or contact us at the collapsesurvivor.com website. But the picture says it all. If it hits the fan, try and blend. So also I want to remind you here to keep your Collapse Survivor app on your phone, even if you're not playing the simulation, so that you can get real, potentially life-saving threat alerts. We have already put a few of those out. A good example was solar flares that occurred not too long ago, earlier this year. So the sooner you know that there's a potential threat, that little bit of time may be the time that you need to get to a safe place, which could be potentially life-saving. The app costs $10 a year, so we encourage you and ask you to tell everyone you know and care about to have the app on their phone. Again, whether you're using the training simulations or not, it does give you that preparedness features on there, and at the same time, you're going to get threat alerts that could save your life. So we'll send out a lessons learned report, actually, not the podcast, but a written report on this last simulation. Uh, and again, you can play this simulation nonstop once it goes into the archives. Uh, so you can learn some more things from it. But there's a prepper knowledge base for you to go to, which is a fantastic index database with a lot of important preparedness and survival topics that you can look at your own leisure. And there's great information there, no advertisements, and a lot of survivalist expert information there for you at the collapsesurvivor.com site. So until the next simulation and training exercise, I just want to wish you well, stay positive, and work hard at trying to be better prepared.
Prepare for the worst, enjoy the present.